So, the last few weeks, we have been having a problem where periodically the stream will stop. And I did a lot of things to fix it, and it seemed to be fixed. But now, it is not. So, that's not great. What's weird is it tends to, like, it happens a couple of times at the start of streams, and then for some reason it will stabilize. And I've changed a huge number of settings, and it's now no longer going red. The little indicator is still stable. It's just OBS periodically stops. So I am going to continue on the assumption that at some point it is going to stop occasionally freezing and warm up. Like, it literally feels like OBS at the moment just needs to warm up, but I have no idea if that is sorry, so I believe we went down during I was reading the second Kofi. On the 21st of December, my new nephew, Dominic Joseph, was born. I'm so glad he's here and that I can stop calling him the Meatball. His mum didn't share his name beforehand. And that was from Kate B. And I think the Meatball is a fine name for a child. Kofi from Sterling Silver. Happy Christmas Eve. Wishing Johnny, Sash, Mods and Chat happy holidays. Happy holidays to you as well. And Kofi from Uffit. Good news, last day of the year, yay. Payday, yay. We got a small bonus, yay. And now I have mulled stuff, mostly cider, in a slow cooker. Do recommend for mulling. It goes on for hours or possibly days as required. Happy whatever all. Happy whatever to you too, Uffit. Enjoy your mulled something. And Sterling Silver is gifting 5 tier 1 subs to the community. That's really lovely. Now, as I said, I'm going to be reading a couple of M.R. James stories. I'm going to be reading Lost Hearts and Time Allowing, the Mezzotint. And if you wish to support in between, I will be reading out any Kofis that come through. So for those of you who don't watch my streams normally, anything we make via Kofis or subscriptions is divided into shares and distributed between myself, Sasha, and the mods. Everyone gets one share. It's pirate style. Everyone gets one share for each stream they do. So for this stream, I will be getting one share. Each of the mods will be getting one share. And how much the shares are worth depends on how much we take in, because it's literally just all the money divided by all the shares. And then if it's less than £21, which would be London living wage for 2 hours, me and Sash, McGuffin Company, will bump it up to 21 to that level. Also, if you just want me reading more spooky stories, I have got a handful on my Bandcamp.
You're frozen for me.
Again? It didn't even say... Am I frozen again?
Wait, everybody else is chatting like you're normal.
Oh, okay.
So I think.
Okay.
Yeah, everyone else says it's just me.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Just.
Sorry,
it's just Sash.
apologies,
Just Sash.
Everyone.
Yeah, because it normally gives me a little thing that says disconnected.
That's just.
Okay.
That's
Good.
My
Good.
issue.
I've currently got 5 stories there, which are called Spectral Tales Volume 1. There will be a Volume 2 at some point when I get around to it. I'm not good at. I'm not good at making time for personal projects that don't have a definitive deadline. But, aren't we all? So, those are a few ways you can support the spooky stories. So, our first ghost story for Christmas. Lost Hearts by M.R. James. It was, as far as I can ascertain, in September of the year 1811 that a post-chaise drew up before the door of Asselby Hall in the heart of Lincolnshire. The little boy, who was the only passenger in the chaise, and who jumped out as soon as it had stopped, looked about him with the keenest curiosity during the short interval that elapsed between the ringing of the bell and the opening of the hall door. He saw a tall, square, red-brick house, built in the reign of Anne. A stone-pillared porch had been added in the purer classical style of 1790. The windows of the house were many, tall and narrow, with small panes and thick white woodwork. A pediment, pierced with a round window, crowned the front. There were wings to the right and left, connected by curious glazed galleries, supported by colonnades with the central block. These wings plainly contained the stables and offices of the house. Each was surmounted by an ornamental cupola with a gilded vane. An evening light shone on the building, making the window panes glow like so many fires. Away from the hall in front stretched a flat park studded with oaks and fringed with firs, which stood out against the sky. The clock in the church tower, buried in trees on the edge of the park, only its golden weathercock catching the light, was striking 6, and the sound came gently beating down the wind. It was altogether a pleasant impression, though tinged with the sort of melancholy appropriate for an evening in early autumn, that was conveyed to the mind of the boy who was standing in the porch, waiting for the door to open to him. The post-chaise had brought him from Warwickshire, where some 6 months before he had been left an orphan. Now, owing to the generous offer of his elderly cousin Mr. Abney, he had come to live at Assaby. The offer was unexpected, because all who knew of Mr. Abney looked upon him as a somewhat austere recluse, in whose steady-going household the advent of a small boy would import a new and, it seemed, incongruous element. The truth is that very little was known of Mr. Abney's pursuits or temper. The professor of Greek at Cambridge had been heard to say that no one knew more of the religious beliefs of the later pagans than did the owner of Assaby. Certainly his library contained all the then available books bearing on the mysteries, the Orphic poems, the worship of Mithras, and the Neoplatonists. In the marble-paved hall stood a fine group of Mithras slaying a bull, which had been imported from the Levant at great expense by the owner. He had contributed a description of it to the Gentleman's Magazine, and he had written a remarkable series of articles in the Critical Museum on the superstitions of the Romans of the Lower Empire. He was looked upon, in fine, as a man wrapped in his books, and it was a matter of great surprise among his neighbours that he should even have heard of his orphan cousin, Stephen Elliott, much more that he should have volunteered to make him an inmate at Assaby Hall. Whatever may have been expected by his neighbours, it is certain that Mr. Abney, the tall, the thin, the austere, seemed inclined to give his young cousin a kindly reception. The moment the front door opened, he darted out of his study, rubbing his hands with delight. "How are you, my boy? How are you? How old are you?" said he. "That is, you are not too much tired, I hope, by your journey to eat your supper?" "No, thank you, sir," said Master Elliot. "I am pretty well." "There's a good lad," said Mr. Abney. "And how old are you, my boy?" It seemed a little odd that he should have asked the question twice in the first 2 minutes of their acquaintance. "I'm 12 years old next birthday, sir," said Stephen. "And, when is your birthday, my dear boy? 11th of September, eh? That's well. That's very well. No, do be quiet. Sorry. Got to mute my phone. That is fine. That's very well. Near a year hence, isn't it? I like to get these things down in my book. Sure it's 12? Certain? Yes, quite sure, sir. Well. Take him to Mrs. Bunch's room, Parks, and let him have his tea, supper, whatever it is. Yes, sir, answered the staid Mr. Parks, and conducted Stephen to the lower regions. Mrs. Bunch was the most comfortable and human person whom Stephen had yet met in Assaby. She made him completely at home. They were great friends in a quarter of an hour, and great friends they remained. Mrs. Bunch had been born in the neighbourhood of some 55 years before the date of Stephen's arrival, and her residence at the Hall was of 20 years' standing. Consequently, if anyone knew the ins and outs of the house and the district, Mrs. Bunch knew them, and she was by no means disinclined to communicate her information. Certainly there were plenty of things about the Hall and the Hall gardens which Stephen, who was of an adventurous and inquiring turn, was anxious to have explained to him. Who built the temple at the end of the Laurel Walk? Who was the old man whose picture hung on the staircase, sitting at a table with a skull under his hand? These and many similar points were cleared up by the resources of Mrs. Bunch's powerful intellect. There were others, however, of which the explanations furnished were less satisfactory. One November evening, Stephen was sitting by the fire in the housekeeper's room, reflecting on his surroundings. "Is Mr. Abney a good man? And will he go to heaven?" he suddenly asked, with the peculiar confidence which children possess in the ability of their elders to settle these questions, the decisions of which is believed to be reserved for other tribunals. "Good! Bless the child!" said Mrs. Bunch. "Master's as kind a soul as ever I see. Didn't I never tell you of the little boy you took in out of the street, as you may say this 7 years back? The little girl, 2 years after I first come here?" "No, do tell me all about them, Mrs. Bunch, now, this minute." "Well," said Mrs. Bunch, "the little girl I don't seem to remember so much about. I know Master brought her back with him from his walk one day, and gave orders to Mrs. Ellis, as was housekeeper then, that she should be took every care with. And the poor child hadn't no one belonging to her. She telled me so her own self, and here she lived with us a matter of 3 weeks it might be. And then, so I've just remembered that there is, in this story, a recurrent use of a slur for the traveller community, so I will be replacing that with traveller, where appropriate. And then, whether she were something of a traveller in her blood or what not, but one morning she out of her bed afore any of us had opened an eye, and neither tack nor yet trace of her I set eyes on since. Master was wonderful put about, and had all the ponds dragged, but it's my belief she was had away by them travellers, for there was singing round the house for much as an hour the night she went, and Parks, he declares he heard them a-calling in the woods all that afternoon. Dear, dear, an odd child she was, so silent in her ways and all, but I was wonderful taken up with her, so domesticated she was. Surprising." "And what about the little boy?" said Stephen. "Ah, that poor boy," sighed Mrs. Bunch. "He were a foreigner. Giovanni, he called himself, and he came a-tweaking his hurdy-gurdy round about the drive one winter day, and Master had him in that minute, and asked all about where he came from, and how old he was, and how he made his way, and where was his relatives, and all as kind as heart as you could wish. But it went the same way with him. They're a unruly lot, them foreign nations, I do suppose, and he was off one fine morning just the same as the girl. Why he went and what he had done was our question for as much as a year after, for he never took his hurdy-gurdy, and there it lays on the shelf." The remainder of the evening was spent by Stephen in miscellaneous cross-examination of Mrs. Bunch, and in efforts to extract a tune from the hurdy-gurdy. That night he had a curious dream. At the end of the passage at the top of the house, in which his bedroom was situated, there was an old disused bathroom. It was kept locked, but the upper half of the door was glazed, and since the muslin curtains which used to hang there had long been gone, you could look in and see the lead-lined bath affixed to the wall on the right hand, with its head towards the window. On the night of which I am speaking, Stephen Elliott found himself, as he thought, looking through the glazed door. The moon was shining through the window, and he was gazing at a figure which lay in the bath. His description of what he saw reminds me of what I once beheld myself in the famous vaults of St. Mission's Church in Dublin, which possess the horrid property of preserving corpses from decay for centuries. A figure inexpressibly thin and pathetic, of a dusty leaden colour, enveloped in a shroud-like garment, the thin lips crooked into a faint and dreadful smile, the hands pressed tightly over the region of the heart. As he looked upon it, A distant, almost inaudible moan seemed to issue from its lips, and the arms began to stir. The terror of the sight forced Stephen backwards, and he awoke to the fact that he was indeed standing on the cold boarded floor of the passage in the full light of the moon. With a courage which I do not think can be common among boys of his age, he went to the door of the bathroom to ascertain if the figure of his dream were really there. It was not, and he went back to bed. Mrs. Bunch was much impressed next morning by his story, and went so far as to replace the muslin curtain over the glazed door of the bathroom. Mr. Abney, moreover, to whom he confided his experiences at breakfast, was greatly interested, and made notes of the matter in what he called his book. The spring equinox was approaching, as Mr. Abney frequently reminded his cousin, adding that this had always been considered by the ancients to be a critical time for the young, that Stephen would do well to take care of himself, and to shut his bedroom window at night, and that Censorinus had some valuable remarks upon the subject. Two incidents that occurred about this time made an impression on Stephen's mind. The first was, after an unusually uneasy and oppressed night that he had passed, though he could not recall any particular dream that he had had. The following evening, Mrs. Bunch was occupying herself in mending his nightgown. "Gracious me, Master Stephen," she broke forth rather irritably. "How do you manage to tear your nightdress all to flinders this way? Look here, sir, what trouble you do give to poor servants that are to darn and mend after you." There was indeed a most destructive and apparently wanton series of slits and scorings in the garment, which would undoubtedly require a skilful needle to make good. These were confined to the left side of the chest, long, parallel slits, about 6 inches in length, some of them not quite piercing the texture of the linen. Stephen could only express his entire ignorance of their origin. He was sure they were not there the night before. "But," he said, "Mrs. Bunch, they are just the same as the scratches on the outside of my bedroom door, and I'm sure I never had anything to do with making them." Mrs. Bunch gazed at him open-mouthed, then snatched up a candle, departed hastily from the room, and was heard making her way upstairs. In a few minutes she came down. "Well," she said, "Master Stephen, it's a funny thing to me how them marks and scratches canna come there. Too high up for any cat or dog to have made 'em, much less a rat. For all the world like a man's fingernails, as my uncle in the tea trade used to tell us when we got them when we was girls together. I wouldn't say nothing to Master, not if I were you, Master Stephen, my dear, and just turn the key of the door when you go to bed." "I always do, Mrs. Bunch, as soon as I've said my prayers." "Ah, there's a good child. Always say your prayers, and then no one can't harm you." Herewith, Mrs. Bunch addressed herself to mending the injured nightgown, with intervals of meditation until bedtime. This was on a Friday night in March, 1812. On the following evening, the usual duet of Stephen and Mrs. Bunch was augmented by the sudden arrival of Mr. Parkes, the butler, who, as a rule, kept himself rather to himself in his own pantry. He did not see that Stephen was there. He was, moreover, flustered, and less slow of speech than was his wont. "Master may get up his own wine if he likes of an evening," was his first remark. "Either I do it in the daytime, or not at all, Mrs. Bunch. I don't know what it may be. Very like it's the rats, or the wind, got into the cellar, but I'm not so young as I was, and I can't go through with it as I have done. Well, Mr. Parkes, you know it is a surprising place for the rats, is the Hall. I'm not denying that, Mrs. Bunch, and to be sure many a time I've heard the tale from the men in the shipyards about the rat that could speak. I never laid any confidence in that before, but tonight, if I'd demeaned myself to lay my ear to the door of the further bin, I could pretty much have heard what they was saying." "Oh, there, Mr. Parkes, I've no patience with your fancies. Rats talking in the wine cellar, indeed." "Well, Mrs. Bunch, I've no wish to argue with you. All I say is, if you choose to go to the far bin and lay your ear to the door, you may prove my words this minute." What nonsense you do talk, Mr. Parks. Not fit for children to listen to. Why, you'll be frightening Master Stephen there out of his wits. What? Master Stephen? Said Parks, awakening to the consciousness of the boy's presence. Master Stephen knows well enough I'm playing a joke with you, Mrs. Bunch. In fact, Master Stephen knew too well to suppose that Mr. Parks had in the first instance intended a joke. He was interested, not altogether pleasantly, in the situation, but all his questions were unsuccessful in inducing the butler to give any more detailed account of his experience in the wine cellar. We have now arrived at March 24th, 1812. It was a day of curious experiences for Stephen, a windy, noisy day which filled the house and the gardens with a restless impression. As Stephen stood by the fence of the grounds and looked out into the park, he felt as if an endless procession of unseen people was sweeping past him on the wind, borne on resistlessly and aimlessly, vainly striving to stop themselves, to catch at something that might arrest their flight and bring them once again into contact with the living world of which they had formed a part. After luncheon that day, Mr. Abney said, "Stephen, my boy, do you think you could manage to come to me tonight, as late as 11 o'clock in my study? I shall be busy until that time, and I wish to show you something connected with your future life, which it is most important that you should know. You are not to mention this matter to Mrs. Bunch, nor to anyone else in the house, and you had better go to your room at the usual time." Here was a new excitement added to life. Stephen eagerly grasped at the opportunity of sitting up till 11 o'clock. He looked in at the library door on his way upstairs that evening, and saw a brazier, which he had often noticed in the corner of the room, moved out before the fire. An old silver-gilt cup stood on the table, filled with red wine, and some written sheets of paper lay near it. Mr. Abney was sprinkling some incense on the brazier from a round silver box as Stephen passed, but did not seem to notice his step. The wind had fallen, and there was a still night and a full moon. At about 10 o'clock, Stephen was standing at the open window of his bedroom, looking out over the country. Still as the night was, the mysterious population of the distant moonlit woods was not yet lulled to rest. From time to time, strange cries, as of lost and despairing wanderers, sounded from across the mere. They might be the notes of owls or water-birds, yet they did not quite resemble either sound. Were they not coming nearer? Now they sounded from the nearer side of the water, and in a few moments they seemed to be floating about among the shrubberies. Then they ceased. But just as Stephen was thinking of shutting his window and resuming his reading of Robinson Crusoe, he caught sight of two figures standing on the gravelled terrace that ran along the garden side of the hall. The figures of a boy and girl, it seemed. They stood, side by side, looking up at the windows. Something in the form of the girl recalled irresistibly his dream of the figure in the bath. The boy inspired more acute fear. Whilst the girl stood still, half smiling, with her hands clasped over her heart, the boy, a thin shape, with black hair and ragged clothing, raised his arms in the air with an appearance of menace and of unappeasable hunger and longing. The moon shone upon his almost transparent hands, and Stephen saw that the nails were fearfully long, and that the light shone through them. As he stood with his arms thus raised, he disclosed a terrifying spectacle. On the left side of his chest there opened a black and gaping rent, and there fell upon Stephen's brain, rather than upon his ear, the impression of one of those hungry and desolate cries that he had heard resounding over the woods of Assaby all that evening. In another moment this dreadful pair had moved swiftly and noiselessly over the dry gravel, and he saw them no more. Inexpressibly frightened as he was, he determined to take his candle down and go to Mr. Abney's study, for the hour appointed for their meeting was near at hand. The study or library opened out of the front hall on one side, and Stephen, urged on by his terrors, did not take long in getting there. To effect an entrance was not so easy. The door was not locked, he felt sure, for the key was on the outside of it as usual. His repeated knocks produced no answer. Mr. Abney was engaged. He was speaking. What Why did he try to cry out? And why was that cry choked in his throat? Had he, too, seen the mysterious children? But now everything was quiet, and the door yielded to Stephen's terrified and frantic pushing. On the table in Mr. Abney's study, certain papers were found, which explained the situation to Stephen Elliott when he was of an age to understand them. The most important sentences were as follows. It was a belief very strongly and generally held by the ancients, of whose wisdom in these matters I have had such experiences as induces me to place confidence in their assertions, that by enacting certain processes which to us moderns have something of a barbaric complexion, a very remarkable enlightenment of the spiritual faculties in man may be attained, that, for example, by absorbing the personalities of a certain number of his fellow creatures, an individual may gain a complete ascendancy over those orders of spiritual beings which control the elemental forces of our universe. It is recorded of Simon Magus that he was able to fly in the air, to become invisible, or to assume any form he pleased, by the agency of the soul of a boy whom, to use the libellous phrase employed by the author of the Clementine Recognitions, he had murdered. I find it set down, moreover, with considerable detail in the writings of Hermes Trismegistus, that similar happy results may be produced by the absorption of the hearts of no less than 3 human beings below the age of 21 years. To testing of the truth of this receipt, I have devoted the greater part of the last 20 years, selecting as the corpora vilia of my experiments such persons as could conveniently be removed, without occasioning a sensible gap in society. The first step I effected by the removal of one Phoebe Stanley, a girl of traveller extraction, on March 24th, 1792. The second by the removal of a wandering Italian lad named Giovanni Paoli, on the night of March 23rd, 1805. The final victim, to employ a word repugnant in the highest degree to my feelings, must be my cousin, Stephen Elliott. His day must be this March 24th, 1812. The best means of effecting the required absorption is to remove the heart from the living subject, to reduce it to ashes, and to mingle them with about a pint of some red wine, preferably port. The remains of the first 2 subjects at least it will be well to conceal. A disused bathroom or wine cellar will be found convenient for such a purpose. Some annoyance may be experienced from the psychic portion of the subjects, which popular language dignifies with the name of ghosts. But the man of philosophic temperament, to whom alone the experiment is appropriate, will be little prone to attach importance to the feeble efforts of these beings to wreak their vengeance on him. I contemplate with the liveliest satisfaction the enlarged and emancipated existence which the experiment, if successful, will confer on me, not only placing me beyond the reach of human justice, so called, but eliminating to a greater extent the prospect of death itself. Mr. Abney was found in his chair, his head thrown back, his face stamped with an expression of rage, fright, and mortal pain. In his left side was a terrible, lacerated wound exposing the heart. There was no blood on his hands, and a long knife that lay on the table was perfectly clean. A savage wildcat may have inflicted the injuries. The window of the study was open, and it was the opinion of the coroner that Mr. Abney had met his death by the agency of some wild creature. But Stephen Elliott's study of the papers I have quoted led him to a very different conclusion. And that was Lost Hearts by M.R. James. Hope you all enjoyed that one. We've had quite a few Ko-fis in the interim. Decomposition Mission subscribed with Prime, thank you. Strawcup513 subscribed, as did Suksaruski. Thank you all. Skoavut is gifting 5 tier 1 subs to the community. That's wonderful. And some Kofis from the Monster Mash. Very happy holidays to everyone I spent Yule with. To everybody. I spent Yule with some lovely queer friends and successfully kept the fire going all night by myself. Have a lovely season. You have a lovely season too, and I love to have a fire. I've never lived anywhere with like an actual fire, but every time I get a chance to, oh yes, Sasha's bringing me a small drink. Every time I,
it's not as small as all that actually.
It's small enough. Every time I stay anywhere with any sort of fire, that's all I'm about. I'm a big lover of feeding a fire and looking after a fire. Every fire is my child. Kofi from the Rain's End. Working retail during the holiday season in America is very painful, but I'm so glad my manager allowed me to take Fridays off. My availability to always catch the stream live. Happy holidays. Happy holidays to you as well, and thank you for tuning in. I'm glad that you're able to. And I'm so sorry you work retail. I have worked retail. It is an nightmare. Kofi from Jim. Thanks Johnny, Sasha and Mods for the spooky story stream. Happy holidays everyone. Happy holidays to you as well. Kofi from Morgan. Happy holidays everybody. I've recently been watching the old Christmas Ghost Stories VOD to get in the Christmas mood, so I got very excited to see that it's happening again, and that I get to be part of it this year. Wishing you all a very spooky holiday. You have a very spooky holiday as well. And Kofi from Nim S. Happy holidays everyone. I moved halfway around the world for postgrad studies this year, and this is my first ever Christmas spent in wintertime. I don't like it very much, but I do understand the appeal of a spooky story on a cold night. So thank you very much for providing. You are very welcome. I'm sorry to hear that. I, as someone who grew up obviously with a wintertime Christmas, I intellectually I sympathise. In my heart, I'm like, you finally get to enjoy a real Christmas, and it's like, oh no, it's just different Christmases around the world, but.
I think it's Neve, by the way. Robert.
Is it Neve? Apologies.
I think so.
But yeah, I love a cold Christmas. And we're up further north than we used to be. We're up in Manchester now, so the Christmas is even colder. And if you do wish more spooky stories read, then do check out my Bandcamp, where I've got 5, including MR James one, The Ash Tree, and a few of my personal favourites, including The Yellow Sign from The King in Yellow by Robert Chambers, and The Signalman by Charles Dickens. Which, I'll be honest, I don't rate I like the short story The Signalman, not quite as much as I like the 1970s Ghost Stories for Christmas TV adaptation, which I will strongly recommend for, I always recommend it for Christmas Eve viewing. It's only like a half hour long, but it's got some good scary vibes. But yes. Oh, and Great Value Serotonin is gifting 5 tier 1 subs to the community. That's wonderful, thank you. And I'm you know what? I'm going to take it as a compliment that I am Great Value Serotonin.
So is Kevin7.
Sorry.
So is Kevin7 also gifting 5 subs.
Oh, wonderful! Sorry, that
Two
one.
people gifting
That one
5
hasn't.
subs.
That one hasn't come through to the Discord yet. For first time, when I say the Discord, there is a private Discord where the mods send through messages, updates, and Ko-fi stuff. So it's not like a public Discord that you're missing out on. So, our second story, the Mezzotint. Some time ago, I believe, I had the pleasure of telling you the story of an adventure which happened to a friend of mine by the name of Denniston during his pursuit of objects of art for the museum at Cambridge. That's a little bit of just stepping out. That's a previously on MR James cut to Canon Olberich's scrapbook. There is exactly know, you don't need to stop this stream and go watch the VOD of me reading Canon Olbricht's scrapbook. But if you want to check it out on my YouTube channel later, that will, expand your appreciation of the MRJCU, the MR James Christmas universe. He did not publish his experiences very widely upon his return to England, but they could not fail to become known to a good many of his friends, and, among others, to the gentleman who, at that time, presided over an art museum at another university. It was to be expected that the story should make a considerable impression on the mind of a man whose vocation lay in lines similar to Deniston's, and that he should be eager to catch at any explanation of the matter which tended to make it seem improbable that he should ever be called upon to deal with so agitating an emergency. It was indeed somewhat consoling to him to reflect that he was not expected to acquire ancient manuscripts for his institution, that was the business of the Shelburnian Library. The authorities of that might, if they pleased, ransack obscure corners of the continent for such matters. He was glad to be obliged at the moment to confine his attention to enlarging the already unsurpassed collection of English topographical drawings and engravings possessed by his museum. Yet, as it turned out, even a department so homely and familiar as this may have its dark corners, and to one of these Mr. Williams was unexpectedly introduced. Those who have taken even the most limited interest in the acquisition of topographical pictures are aware that there is one London dealer whose aid is indispensable to these researches. Mr. J. W. Britnell publishes at short intervals very admirable catalogues of a large and constantly changing stock of engravings, plans, and old sketches of mansions, churches, and towns in England and Wales. These catalogues were, of course, the ABC of his subject to Mr. Williams, but as his museum already contained an enormous accumulation of topographical pictures, he was a regular, rather than a copious, buyer, and he rather looked to Mr. Britnell to fill up gaps in the rank and file of his collection than to supply him with rarities. Now, in February of last year, there appeared upon Mr. Williams' desk at the museum a catalogue from Mr. Britnell's emporium, and accompanying it was a typewritten communication from the dealer himself. The letter ran as follows. Dear Sir, we beg to call to your attention number 978 in our accompanying catalogue, which we shall be glad to send on approval. Yours faithfully, J. W. Britnell. To turn to number 978 is the accompanying catalogue was, with Mr. Williams, as he observed to himself, the work of a moment, and in the place indicated he found the following entry. 978. Unknown. Interesting Mezzotint. View of a manor house, early part of the century. 15 by 10 inches, black frame. £2, 2 shillings. It was not specially exciting, and the price seemed high. However, as Mr. Britnell, who knew his business and his customer seemed to set store by it, Mr. Williams wrote a postcard asking for the article to be sent on approval, along with some other engravings and sketches which appeared in the same catalogue. And so he passed without much excitement or anticipation to the ordinary labours of the day. A parcel of any kind always arrives a day later than you expect it, and that of Mr. Britnell proved, as I believe the right phrase goes, no exception to the rule. It was delivered at the museum by the afternoon post of Saturday, after Mr. Williams had left his work, and it was accordingly brought round to his room in college by the attendant, in order that he might not have to wait over Sunday before looking through it and returning such of the contents as he did not propose to keep. And here he found it when he came to tea with a friend. The only item with which I am concerned was the rather large, black-framed Mezzotint, of which I have already quoted the short description given in Mr. Britnell's catalogue. I've just realised, as I'm reading this, that there are probably quite a few viewers who don't actually know what a Mezzotint is. A Mezzotint is a particular style of drawing, of engraving specifically, which uses a lot of very thin lines.
It's like, you know those scratchable arts that you get when you're a kid, and it's got like, you get a little tiny scratching pen and there's lines on it and you scratch away and then it leaves like foil. It's like an old-fashioned professional version of that, except that instead of having a black covering and metallic foil underneath, it's actually the black lines.
I do encourage, if those of you watching on a computer where you can easily do a search while also watching the stream, just have a quick Google for Mezzotint, Mezzotint, because it's quite an effective sort of art style, and I think this is the sort of story where being able to picture the style really adds a little something. The only item with which I am concerned was the rather large black-framed Mezzotint, of which I have already quoted the short description given in Mr. Britnell's catalogue. Some more details of it will have to be given, though I cannot hope to put before you the look of the picture as clearly as it presents to my own eye. Very nearly the exact duplicate of it may be seen in a good many old inn parlours, or in the passages of undisturbed country mansions in the present moment. It was a rather indifferent Mezzotint, and an indifferent Mezzotint is perhaps the worst form of engraving known. It presented a full-face view of a not very large manor house of the last century, with 3 rows of plain sashed windows, with rusticated masonry about them, a parapet with balls and vases at the angles, and a small portico in the centre. On either side were trees, and in front of a considerable expanse of lawn. The legend AWF Sculpsit was engraved on the narrow margin, and there was no further inscription. The whole thing gave the impression that it was the work of an amateur. What in the world Mr. Britnell could mean by affixing the price of £2 2 shillings to such an object was more than Mr. Williams could imagine. He turned it over with a good deal of contempt. Upon the back was a paper label, the left-hand half of which had been torn off. All that remained were the ends of 2 lines of writing. The first had the letters Ngi Hall, and the second, sex.
I'm so sorry.
No, you're quite right. You're quite right. -SSEX. For Americans, quite a lot of English counties end with SSEX. Sussex, Essex, the fictional county of Wessex. But as written, to be read, the second, this half of the label is Ngi Hall in sex. So, yes. It would perhaps be just worthwhile to identify the place represented, which he could easily do with the help of a gazetteer, and then he would send it back to Mr. Britnell with some remarks reflecting upon the judgment of that gentleman. Oops. To turn to number 997... Oh, wait. No, sorry. Yes, sorry. He lighted the candles, for it was now dark, made the tea, and supplied the friend with whom he had been playing golf, for I believe the authorities of the university I write of indulge in that pursuit by way of relaxation, and tea was taken to the accompaniment of a discussion which golfing persons can imagine for themselves, but which the conscientious writer has no right to inflict upon any non-golfing person. I love M.R. James does not like golf, and it comes up in a surprising number of his stories. The conclusion arrived at was that certain strokes might have been better, and that in certain emergencies neither player had experienced that amount of luck which a human being has a right to expect. It was now that his friend, let us call him Professor Binks, took up the framed engraving and said, "What's this place, Williams?" "Just what I am going to try and find out," said Williams, going back to the shelf for a gazetteer. "Look at the back, somethingly Hall, either in Sussex or Essex. Half the name's gone, you see. You don't happen to know it, do you?" "It's from that man Britnell, I suppose, isn't it?" said Binks. "Is it for the museum?" "Well, I think I should buy it if the price were 5 shillings, said Williams. "But for some unearthly reason he wants 2 guineas for it. I can't conceive why. It's a wretched engraving, and there aren't even any figures to give life to it." "Well, it's not worth 2 guineas, I should think," said Binks. "But I don't think it's so badly done. The moonlight seems rather good to me, and I should have thought that there were figures, or at least a figure, just on the edge, in front." "Let's look," said Williams. "Well, it's true the light is rather cleverly given. Where's your figure?" "Oh, yes, just the head, in the very front of the picture." And indeed there was. Hardly more than a black blot on the extreme edge of the engraving. The head of a man or a woman, a good deal muffled up, the back turned to the spectator and looking towards the house. Williams had not noticed it before. "Still," he said, "though it's a cleverer thing than I thought, I can't spend 2 guineas of museum money on a picture of a place I don't know." Professor Binks had his work to do, and soon went, and very nearly up to hall time, Williams was engaged in a vain attempt to identify the subject of the picture. If the vowel before the had only been left, it would have been easy enough, he thought. But as it is, the name may be anything from Guestingly to Langley. And there are many more names ending like this than I thought, and this rotten book has no index of terminations. Hall, in Mr. Williams' college, was at 7. It need not be dwelt upon, the less so as he met their colleagues who had been playing golf during the afternoon, and words with which we have no concern were freely bandied across the table, merely golfing words, I would hasten to explain. I suppose an hour or more to have been spent in what is called common room after dinner. Later in the evening some few retired to Williams' rooms, and I have little doubt that whist was played and tobacco smoked. During a lull in these operations, William picked up the Mezzotint from the table without looking at it, and handed it to a person mildly interested in art, telling him where it had come from and the other particulars which we already know. The gentleman took it carelessly, looked at it, then said, in a tone of some interest, "It's really a very good piece of work, Williams. It has quite a feeling of the romantic period. The light is admirably managed, it seems to me, and the figure, though it's rather too grotesque, is somehow very impressive." "Yes, isn't it?" said Williams, who was just then busy giving whisky and soda to others in the company, and was unable to come across the room to look at the view again. It was by this time rather late in the evening, and the visitors were on the move. After they went, Williams was obliged to write a letter or two and to clear up some odd bits of work. At last, some time past midnight, he was disposed to turn in, and he put out his lamp after lighting his bedroom candle. The picture lay face up on the table where the last man who looked at it had put it down, and it caught his eye as he turned the lamp. What he saw made him very nearly drop the candle on the floor, and he declares now that if he had been left in the dark at that moment, he would have had a fit. But as that did not happen, he was able to put down the light on the table and take a good look at the picture. It was indubitable, rankly impossible, no doubt, but absolutely certain. In the middle of the lawn, in front of the unknown house, there was a figure where no figure had been at 5 o'clock that afternoon. It was crawling on all fours towards the house, and it was muffled in a strange black garment with a white cross on the back. I do not know what is the ideal course to pursue in a situation of this kind. I can only tell you what Mr. Williams did. He took the picture by one corner and carried it across the passage to a second set of rooms which he possessed. There he locked it in a drawer, sported the door of both sets of rooms, and retired to bed. But first he wrote out and signed an account of the extraordinary change which the picture had undergone since it had come into his possession. Sleep visited him rather late, but it was consoling to reflect that the behaviour of the picture did not depend upon his own unsupported testimony. Evidently the man who had looked at it the night before had seen something of the same kind as he had. Otherwise he might have been tempted to think that something gravely wrong was happening either to his eyes or to his mind. This possibility being fortunately precluded, 2 matters awaited him on the morrow. He must take stock of the picture very carefully, and call in a witness, for the purpose, and he must make a determined effort to ascertain which house it was that was represented. He would therefore ask his neighbour Nisbet to breakfast with him, and he would subsequently spend a morning over the gazetteer. Nisbet was disengaged and arrived about 9:30. His host was not quite dressed, I am sorry to say, even at this late hour. During breakfast, nothing was said about the Mezzotint by Williams, save that he had a picture on which he wished for Nisbet's opinion. But those who are familiar with university life can picture for themselves the wide and delightful range of subjects over which the conversation of two fellows of Canterbury College is likely to extend during a Sunday morning breakfast. Hardly a topic was left unchallenged, from golf to lawn tennis. Yet I am bound to say that Williams was rather distraught, for his interest naturally centred on that very strange picture which was now reposing, face downwards, in the drawer in the room opposite. The morning pipe was at last lighted, and the moment had arrived for which he looked. With very considerable, almost tremulous excitement, he ran across, unlocked the door, and extracted the picture, still face downwards, ran back, and put it into Nisbet's hand. "Now," he said, "Nisbet, I want you to tell me exactly what you see in that picture. Describe it, if you don't mind, rather minutely. I'll tell you why afterwards."
"Well," said Nisbet, "I have here a view of a country house, English, I presume, by moonlight."
"Moonlight? You're sure of that?"
"Certainly. The moon appears to be on the wane, if you wish for details, and there are clouds in the sky."
"All right, go on. I'll swear," added Williams in an aside. "There was no moon when I saw it first."
"Well, there's not much more to be said," Nisbet continued. "The house has 1, 2, 3 rows of windows, 5 in each row, except at the bottom where there's a porch instead of the middle one. And,
"What of the figures?" said Williams, with a marked interest.
"There aren't any," said Nisbet. "But—"
"What? No figure on the grass in front?"
"Not a thing."
"You'll swear to that?"
"Certainly I will, but there's just one other thing."
"What?"
"Why, one of the windows on the ground floor, left of the door, is open."
"Is it really? My goodness, he must have got in," said Williams with great excitement. And he hurried to the back of the sofa on which Nisbet was sitting, and catching the picture from him, verified the matter for himself. It was quite true. There was no figure, and there was the open window. Williams, after a moment of speechless surprise, went to the writing table and scribbled for a short time. Then he brought 2 papers to Nisbet and asked him to sign one. It was his own description of the picture, which you have just heard, and then to read the other, which was William's statement written the night before.
"What can it all mean?"
said Nisbet. "Exactly," said Williams. "Well, one thing I must do, or 3 things, now I think of it. I must find out from Garwood," this was his last night's visitor, "what he saw. And then I must get the thing photographed before it goes further. And then I must find out what the place is."
"I can do the photographing myself," said Nisbet, "and I will. But, you know, it looks very much as if we were assisting at the working out of a tragedy somewhere. The question is, has it happened already, or is it going to come off? You must find out where the place is, yes," he said, looking at the picture again. "I expect you're right. He has got in. And if I don't mistake, there'll be the devil to pay in one of the rooms upstairs." "I tell you what," said Williams, "I'll take the picture across to old Green." This was the senior fellow of the college, who had been bursar for many years. "It's quite likely he'll know it. We have property in Essex and Sussex, and he must have been over the 2 counties a lot in his time." "Quite likely he will," said Nisbet. "But just let me take a photograph first. But look here, I rather think Green isn't up today. He wasn't in hall last night, and I think I heard him say he was going down for the Sunday."
"That's true too," said Williams. "I know he's gone to Brighton. Well, if you'll photograph it now, I'll go across to Garwood and get his statement, and you keep an eye on it while I'm gone. I'm beginning to think 2 guineas is not a very exorbitant price for it now." In a short time he had returned, and brought Mr. Garwood with him. Garwood's statement was to the effect that the figure, which he had seen, was clear at the edge of the picture, was clear of the edge of the picture, but had not got far across the lawn. He remembered a white mark on the back of its drapery, but could not have been sure it was a cross. A document to this effect was then drawn up and signed, and Nisbet proceeded to photograph the picture.
"Now, what do you mean to do?" he said. "You going to sit and watch it all day?"
"Well, no, I think not," said Williams. "I rather imagine we're meant to see the whole thing. You see, between the time I saw it last night and this morning, there was time for lots of things to happen, but the creature only got into the house. It could easily have got through its business in the time and gone to its own place again, but the fact of the window being open, I think, must mean that it's in there now. So I feel quite easy about leaving it. And besides, I have a kind of idea that it wouldn't change much at all in the daytime. We must go out for a walk this afternoon and come in to tea, or whenever it gets dark. I shall leave it out on the table here and sport the door. My skip can get in, but no one else." The three agreed that this would be a good plan, and further, that if they spent the afternoon together, they would be less likely to talk about the business to other people, for any rumour of such a transaction as was going on would bring the whole of the Phantasmagorical Society about their ears. We must give them respite until 5 o'clock. At or near that hour, the three were entering William's staircase. They were at first only slightly annoyed to see that the door of his rooms was unsported, but in a moment it was remembered that on Sunday the skips came for orders an hour or so earlier than on weekdays. However, a surprise was awaiting them. The first thing they saw was the picture leaning up against a pile of books on the table, as it had been left. And the next thing was William's skip. Just a note, a skip is, I believe, a cleaner, essentially, who used to work for the faculty of universities and look after their rooms. And the next thing was William's skip, seated on a chair opposite, gazing at it with undisguised horror. How was this? Mr. Filcher, the name is not my own invention, was a servant of considerable standing, and set the standard of etiquette to all his own college, and to several neighbouring ones, and nothing could be more alien to his practice than to be found sitting on his master's chair, or appearing to take any particular notice of his master's furniture or pictures. Indeed, he seemed to feel that himself. He started violently when the three men came into the room, and got up with a marked effort. Then he said, I ask your pardon, sir, for taking such a freedom as to set it down." "Not at all, Robert," interposed Mr. Williams. "I was meaning to ask you some time what you thought of that picture." "Well, sir, of course I don't set up my opinion again yours, but it ain't a picture I should hang where my little girl could see it, sir." "Wouldn't you, Robert? Why not?" "No, sir. Why, the poor child, I recommend once she see a door Bible with pictures not half what that is, and we had to sit up with her for 3 or 4 nights afterwards, if you'll believe me. And if she was to catch a sight of that skeleton here, or whatever it is, carrying off that poor baby, she would be in a taking. You know how it is with children, how nervish they can get with a little thing and all. But what I should say, it don't seem a right picture to be laying about, sir. Not where anyone that's liable to be startled could come on it. Should you be wanting anything this evening, sir? Thank you, sir." With these words, the excellent man went to continue the round of his masters, and you may be sure the gentleman whom he had left lost no time in gathering round the engraving. There was the house, as before, under the waning moon and the drifting clouds. The window that had been open was shut, and the figure was once more on the lawn, but not this time crawling cautiously on hands and knees. Now it was erect, and stepping swiftly, with long strides towards the front of the picture. The moon was behind it, and the black drapery hung down over its face, so that only hints of that could be seen. And what was visible made the spectators profoundly thankful that they could see no more than a white dome-like forehead and a few straggling hairs. The head was bent down, and the arms were tightly clasped over an object which could be dimly seen and identified as a child. Whether dead or living, it was not possible to say. The legs of the appearance alone could be plainly discerned, and they were horribly thin. From 5 to 7 the three companions sat and watched the picture by turns, but it never changed. They agreed at last that it would be safe to leave it, and that they would return after Hall and await further developments. When they assembled again, at the earliest possible moment, the engraving was there, but the figure was gone, and the house was quiet under the moonbeams. There was nothing for it but to spend the evening over gazetteers and guidebooks. Williams was the lucky one at last, and perhaps he deserved it. At 11:30 p.m. he read from Murray's Guide to Essex the following lines. 16.5 miles. Anningley. The church has been an interesting building of Norman date, but was extensively classicized in the last century. It contains the tombs of the family of Francis, whose mansion, Anningley Hall, a solid Queen Anne house, stands immediately beyond the churchyard in a park of about 80 acres. The family is now extinct, the last heir having disappeared mysteriously in infancy in the year 1802. The father, Mr. Arthur Francis, was locally known as a talented amateur engraver in Mezzotint. After his son's disappearance, he lived in complete retirement at the Hall, and was found dead in his studio on the 3rd anniversary of the disaster, having just completed an engraving of the house, impressions of which are of considerable rarity. This looked like business, and indeed Mr. Green, on his return, at once identified the house as Anningley Hall. "Is there any kind of explanation of the figure, Green?" was the question which Williams naturally asked. "I don't know, I'm sure, Williams. What used to be said in the place where I first knew it, which was before I came up here, was just this. Old Francis was always very much down on these poaching fellows, and whenever he got a chance he used to get a man, whom he suspected of it, turned off the estate, and by degrees he got rid of them, all but one. Squires could do a lot of things then that they daren't think of now. Well, this man that was left was what you find pretty often in that country, the last remains of a very old family. I believe they were lords of the manor at one time. I recollect just such a thing in my own parish." "What, like the man in Tess of D'Urberville's?" Williams put it. "Yes, I dare say. It's not a book I could ever read myself, but this fellow could show a row of tombs in the church that belonged to him or his ancestors, and all that went sour for him a bit. But Francis, they said, could never get at him. He always kept just on the right side of the law. Until one night the keepers found him at it in a wood, right at the end of the estate. I could show you the place now. It marches with some land that used to belong to an uncle of mine, and you can imagine there was a row, and this man Gordy, that was the name, to be sure, Gordy, I thought I should get it, Gordy. He was unlucky enough, poor chap, to shoot a keeper. Well, that was what Francis wanted, and grand juries, you know what they would have been then. And poor Gordy was strung up in double quick time, and I've been shown the place he was buried in, on the north side of the church. You know the way in that part of the world. Anyone that's been hanged or made away with themselves, they bury them on that side. And the idea was that some friend of Gordy's, not a relation because he had none, poor devil, he was the last of his line, kind of special dimagentis, must have planned to get hold of Francis's boy and put an end to his line too. I don't know, it's rather an out-of-the-way thing for an Essex poacher to think of, but, you know, I should say now it looks more as if old Gordy had managed the job himself. Ah, boo. I hate to think of it. Have some whiskey, Williams." The facts were communicated by Williams to Denniston, and by him to a mixed company of which I was one, and the Sadducean professor of orpheology another. I am sorry to say that the latter, when asked what he thought of it, only remarked, "Oh, those Bridgeford people will say anything," a sentiment which met with the reception it deserved. I have only to add that the picture is now in the Ashleyan Museum, that it has been treated with a view to discovering whether sympathetic ink has been used in it, but without effect. That Mr. Britnell knew nothing of it, save that he was sure it was uncommon, and that, though carefully watched, it has never been known to change again. And that is the Mezzotint. This has actually gone quicker than I thought. These ones usually run closer to an hour each, but I've powered through these two, so I think you might get a third. But first, time to look at the intervening Ko-fis. Femme Fatale TF2 subscribed at tier 1, thank you. Cavern7 gifted 5 subs, thank you. A Ko-fi from Victorian London Fog. Wanted to pass along that this week I'm going to be finishing up a small campaign of Dusk Hollow PD for my family using the Simple World system. We've had a great time. Thank you and Sasha for the great time. That's really lovely to hear, and while I'm very glad you've been enjoying Dusk Hollow PD, you can take complete responsibility for the good time. I'm
happy to take a little responsibility.
Okay, we'll take a little responsibility, but
I'm happy to take a share.
Okay, we'll take our fair share, but fundamentally, it's a good campaign because you're running a good campaign. Uffit is gifting 10 tier 1 subs to the community. Thank you, Uffit. Kofi from Sooks, thanks for the spooks. It makes my holiday. Thank you. Kofi from Sofit Goes, thanks for the stream. It's actually very useful for me, because after TMA introduced me to horror, I decided to write a horror short story as a school project, so I've been reading many over the past few weeks for inspiration and just for fun. It's been a great time so far. That's really good, and I hope it introduces you to the wider world of horror and horror stories, because, there's some great stuff out there. Kofi from Oddie B. Happy holidays, all. Happy holidays, Oddie. Kofi from Ellie. Hi, Johnny. Making my family...
Eli.
Oh, Eli, sorry. Kofi from Eli. Hi, Johnny. Making my family watch your stream at an early Christmas dinner, which is my favourite holiday pastime. Merry Christmas to you and yours. Merry Christmas to you, Eli, and I'm sorry I mispronounced your name in front of your whole family. That must be very embarrassing for you. Lisune. Oh my god, I set my phone down on my pillow and my cat immediately ran over to curl up around Johnny's reading and purr like a lunatic. Ah! I love it. I really like hearing that people's pets like my voice. It's dumb, but I like it. Kofi from Miramar. Hi, Johnny and Sasha. I hope you and the cats are staying warm. It is far too cold here. About minus 25 degrees Celsius.
That's too cold.
That's way too cold. But we do have a wood fireplace, so that we've been making good use of. I hope your holidays are fun, and thank you for the stories. You are very welcome, and I am glad you've got a good fire going, because that is too cold. I mean, I love a cold day, but there's cold day, and there's no thank you. Maddie sent through a Kofi. Man and girl go out to drive under moonlight. Oh my god.
You have to do a dramatic reading of this one for me.
Man and girl go out to drive under moonlight. They stop at on old side of the road. He turned to his girl and say, "Baby, I love you very much." "What is it, honey?" "Our car is broken down. I think the engine is broken. It'll walk and get some more fuel." "Okay, it'll stay here and look after our stereo. There have been news reports of stereos being stolen." "Good idea. Keep the doors locked, no matter what. I love you, sweaty." So the guy left to get all for the car. After 2 hours, the girl say, "Where's my baby? He was supposed to be back by now." Then the girl hear a scratching sound and a voice say, "Let me in." The girl doesn't do it, and then after a while, she goes to sleep. The next morning, she wakes up and finds her boyfriend still not there. She gets out to check, and man, door, hand, hook, car door. That was Man, Door, Hand, Hook, Car Door by Anonymous. And last Kofi by Shiny Happy Goth. Thank you for the spooks. I love how systematic Williams is about the whole Mezzotint business. Delighted to hear you read this one. Yeah, it's a weird one, because it's one of those ones that it's still good and really interesting, but it's one of those ones that feels more foundational. Like, it is one of the it's like it is the OG. There is a picture that changes every time you look at it story. And in many ways it doesn't, because it's the first one, it doesn't really do anything more than that. It's just like, here's a picture, changes when you look at it. Pretty spooky, eh? and you're like, oh yeah, a bit spooky. But it's the sort of thing that like so many things have riffed on since. But I've got a lot of affection for it. Right. Now, what one should we do for the third? Let's see. I've done the ash tree. I haven't done number 13. I don't really remember number 13, but you know what? Let's give it a shot and see if it's any good. I mean, it's going to be at the very least a little bit spooky. So let us see how we go. So, number 13 by M.R. James. Among the towns of Jutland, Viborg, among the towns of Jutland, Viborg justly holds a high place. It is the seat of a bishopric. It has a handsome but almost entirely new cathedral, a charming garden, a lake of great beauty, and many storks. Near it is Hald, accounted one of the prettiest things in Denmark, and hard by it is Finderup, where Mask Stig murdered King Eric Glipping at on St. Celia's Day in the year 1286. 56 blows of square-headed iron maces were traced on Eric's skull when his tomb was opened in the 17th century. But I am not writing a guidebook. There are good hotels in Viborg. Priestlers and the Phoenix are all that can be desired. But my cousin, whose experiences I have to tell you now, went to the Golden Lion the first time he visited Viborg. He has not been there since, and the following pages will perhaps explain the reason for his abstention. The Golden Lion is one of the very few houses in the town that was not destroyed in the Great Fire of 1726, which particularly demolished the cathedral, the Skogneskerk, the Radhus, and so much else that was old and interesting. It is a great red brick house, that is, the front of it is brick, with Corby steps on the gables and a text over the door. But the courtyard into which the omnibus drives is of black and white cage work in wood and plaster. The sun was declining in the heavens when my cousin walked up to the door, and the light smote full upon the imposing facade of the house. He was delighted with the old-fashioned aspect of the place, and promised himself a thoroughly satisfactory and amusing stay in an inn so typical of old Jutland. It was not business, in the ordinary sense of the word, that had brought Mr. Anderson to Viborg. He was engaged upon some researches into the church history of Denmark, and it had come to his knowledge that the Rigsarkiv of Viborg there were papers, saved from the fire, relating to the last days of Roman Catholicism in the country. He proposed, therefore, to spend a considerable time, perhaps as much as a fortnight or 3 weeks, in examining and copying these, and he hoped that the Golden Lion would be able to give him a room of sufficient size to serve alike as a bedroom and a study. His wishes were explained to the landlord, and, after a certain amount of thought, the latter suggested that perhaps it might be the best way for the gentleman to look at him, or to look at 1 or 2 of the larger rooms and pick one for himself. It seemed a good idea. The top floor was soon rejected as entailing too much getting upstairs after a day's work. The second floor contained no room of exactly the dimensions required, but on the first floor there was a choice of 2 or 3 rooms which would, so far as size went, suit admirably. The landlord was strongly in favour of number 17, but Mr. Anderson pointed out that its windows commanded only the blank wall of the next house, and that it would be very dark in the afternoon. Either number 12 or number 14 would be better, for both of them looked on the street, and the bright evening light and the pretty view would more than compensate for the additional amount of noise. Eventually number 12 was selected. Like its neighbours, it had 3 windows, all on one side of the room. It was fairly high and unusually long. There was, of course, no fireplace, but the stove was handsome and rather old, a cast-iron erection, on the side of which was a representation of Abraham. Are you giggling?
No,
Are you giggling at cast-iron erections,
No,
Sasha?
it's very spooky. It's very spooky and serious. I would not giggle.
Can't believe you're giggling at M.R. James's cast-iron erection. There was, of course, no fireplace, but the stove was handsome and rather old, a cast-iron erection. on the side of which was a representation of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, and the inscription One Bogmos Cap 22 above. Nothing else in the room was remarkable. The only interesting picture was an old coloured print of the town, data about 1820. Supper time was approaching, but when Anderson, refreshed by the ordinary ablutions, descended the staircase, there were still a few minutes before the bell rang. He devoted them to examining the list of his fellow lodgers. As is usual in Denmark, their names were displayed on a large blackboard, divided into columns and lines, the number of the rooms being painted in at the beginning of each line. The list was not exciting. There was an advocate, or sagfører, a German, and some bagmen from Copenhagen. The one and only point which suggested any food for thought was the absence of any number 13 from the tale of the rooms, and even this was a thing which Anderson had already noticed half a dozen times in his experience of Danish hotels. He could not help wondering whether the objection to that particular number, common as it was so widespread and so strong as to make it difficult to let a room so ticketed, and he resolved to ask the landlord if he and his colleagues in the profession had actually met with many clients who refused to be accommodated in the 13th room. He had nothing to tell me, I am giving the story as I heard it from him, about what passed at supper and in the evening, which was spent in unpacking and arranging his clothes, books and papers, was not more eventful. Towards 11 o'clock he resolved to go to bed, and with him, as with a good many other people nowadays, an almost necessary preliminary to bed, if he meant to sleep, was the reading of a few pages of print, and he had now remembered that the particular book which he had been reading on the train, and which alone would satisfy him at that present moment, was in the pocket of his greatcoat, then hanging on a peg outside the dining room. To run down and secure it was the work of a moment, and as the passages were by no means dark, it was not difficult for him to find his way to his own door. Soon, so at least he thought, but when he arrived there and turned the handle, the door entirely refused to open, and he caught the sound of a hasty movement towards it from within. Had he tried the wrong door? Oh, he had tried the wrong door, of course. Was his own room to the right or to the left? He glanced at the number. It was 13. His room would be on the left, and so it was. And not before he had been in bed for some minutes had he read his wonted 3 or 4 pages of his book, blown out his light, and turned over to go to sleep, did it occur to him that, whereas on the blackboard of the hotel there had been no number 13, there was undoubtedly a room number 13 in the hotel. He felt rather sorry he had not chosen it for his own. Perhaps he might have done the landlord a little service by occupying it, and given him the chance of saying that a well-born English gentleman had lived in it for 3 weeks and liked it very much. And probably it was used as a servant's room or something of the kind. After all, it was most likely not so large or good a room as his own, and he looked drowsily about the room, which was fairly perceptible in the half-light from the street lamp. It was a curious effect, he thought. Rooms usually look larger in a dim light than a full one, but this seemed to have contracted in length and grown proportionally higher. Well, well. Sleep was more important than these vague ruminations, and to sleep he went. On the day after his arrival, Anderson attacked the Rigsarkiv of Viborg. He was, as one might expect in Denmark, kindly received, and access to all that he wished to see was made as easy for him as possible. The documents laid before him were far more numerous and interesting than he had anticipated. Besides official papers, there was a large bundle of correspondence related to Bishop Jorgen Friis, the last Roman Catholic who held the see, and in there cropped up many amusing and what are called intimate details of private life and the individual character. There was much talk of a house owned by the bishop, but not inhabited by him in the town. Its tenant was apparently something of a scandal and a stumbling block to the reforming party. He was a disgrace, they wrote, to the city. He practised secret and wicked arts, and had sold his soul to the enemy. It was of a piece with the gross corruption and superstition of the Babylonish church that such a viper and blood-sucking Troldmund should be patronized and harboured by the bishop. The bishop met these reproaches boldly. He protested his own abhorrence of all such things as secret arts, and required his antagonists to bring the matter before the proper court, of course, the spiritual court, and sift it to the bottom. No one could be more ready and willing than himself to condemn No one could be more ready and willing than himself to condemn Magistrate Nicholas Franken if the evidence showed him to have been guilty of any of the crimes informally alleged against him. Anderson had not time to do more than glance at the next letter of the Protestant leader, Rasmus Nielsen, before the record office was closed for the day, but he gathered its general tenor, which was to the effect that Christian men were no longer bound by the decisions of bishops of Rome, and that the bishop's court was not, and could not be, a fit or competent tribunal to judge so grave and weighty a cause. On leaving the office, Mr. Anderson was accompanied by the old gentleman who presided over it, and as they walked, the conversation very naturally turned to the papers of which I have just been speaking. Herr Scavenius, the archivist of Viborg, though very well informed as to the general run of the documents under his charge, was not a specialist in those of the Reformation period. He was much interested in what Anderson had to tell him about them. He looked forward with great pleasure, he said, to seeing the publication in which Mr. Anderson spoke of embodying their contents. "This house of the Bishop Fries," he added, "it is a great puzzle to me where it could have stood. I have studied carefully the topography of old Viborg, but it is most unlikely of the old terrier of the bishop's property, which was made in 1560, and of which we have a greater part in the archive. Just the piece which had the list of the town property is missing. Never mind. Perhaps I shall some day succeed to find him." After taking some exercise, I forget exactly how or where, Anderson went back to the Golden Lion, his supper, his game of patience, and his bed. On the way to his room, it occurred to him that he had forgotten to talk to the landlord about the omission of number 13 from the hotel, and also that he might as well make sure that number 13 did actually exist before he made any reference to the matter. The decision was not difficult to arrive at. There was the door with its number as plain as could be, and work of some kind was evidently going on inside it, for as he neared the door he could hear footsteps and voices, or a voice, within. During the few seconds in which he halted to make sure of the number, the footsteps ceased, seemingly very near the door, and he was a little startled at hearing a quick, hissing breathing, as of a person in strong excitement. He went on to his own room, and again he was surprised to find out how much smaller it seemed now than it had when he had selected it. It was a slight disappointment, but only slight. He had found it really not large enough, but if he found it really not large enough, he could very easily shift to another. In the meantime, he wanted something. As far as I remember, it was a pocket handkerchief out of his portmanteau, which had been placed by the porter on a very inadequate trestle or stool against the wall at the farthest end of the room from his bed. Here was a very curious thing. The portmanteau was not to be seen. It had been moved by officious servants. Doubtless the contents had been put in the wardrobe. No, none of them were there. This was vexatious. The idea of theft he dismissed at once. Such things rarely happen in Denmark, but some piece of stupidity had certainly been performed, which is not so uncommon, and the stupige must be severely spoken to. Whatever it was that he wanted, it was not so necessary to his comfort he could not wait until morning for it, and he therefore settled not to ring the bell and disturb the servants. He went to the window, the right-hand window as it was, and looked out on the quiet street. There was a tall building opposite, with large spaces of dead wall, no passers-by, a dark night, and very little to be seen of any kind. The light was behind him, and he could see his own shadow cast clearly on the wall opposite. Also the shadow of the bearded man in number 11 on his left, who passed to and fro in shirt-sleeves once or twice, and was seen first brushing his hair and later on in a nightgown. Also the shadow of the occupant of number 13 on the right. This might be more interesting. Number 13 was, like himself, leaning on his elbows on the windowsill, looking out into the street. He seemed to be a tall, thin man. Was it by any chance a woman? At least, it was someone who covered his hair, or it was someone who covered his or her head with some kind of drapery before going to bed, and he thought, must be possessed of a red lampshade, and the lamp must be flickering very much. There was a distant playing up and down of the dull red light on the opposite wall. He craned out a little to see if he could make any more of the figure, but beyond a fold of some light, perhaps white material on the windowsill, he could see nothing. Now came a distant step in the street, and its approach seemed to recall number 13 to a sense of his exposed position, for very swiftly and suddenly he swept away from the window, and his red light went out. Anderson, who had been smoking a cigarette, laid the end of it on the windowsill and went to bed. Next morning he was woke by the stupide with a hot water, etc. He roused himself, and after thinking out the correct Danish words, said as distinctly as he could, "You must not move my portmanteau. Where is it?" As is not uncommon, the maid laughed and went away without making any distinct answer. Anderson, rather irritated, sat up in bed, intended to call her back, but he remained sitting up, staring straight in front of him. There was his portmanteau on its trestle, exactly where he had seen the porter put it when he first arrived. This was a rude shock for a man who prided himself on the accuracy of his observation. How it could possibly have escaped him the night before he did not pretend to understand. At any rate, there it was now. The daylight showed more than the portmanteau. It let the true proportions of the room with its 3 windows appear, and satisfied its tenant that his choice, after all, had not been a bad one. When he was almost dressed, he walked to the middle one of the 3 windows to look out at the weather. Another shock awaited him. Strangely unobservant he must have been last night. He could have sworn 10 times over that he had been smoking at the right-hand window the last thing before he went to bed, and here was his cigarette end on the sill of the middle window. He started to go down for breakfast. Rather late, but number 13 was later. Here were his boots still outside his door, a gentleman's boot. So then number 13 was a man, not a woman. Just then he caught sight of the number on the door. It was 14. He thought he must have passed number 13 without noticing it. 3 stupid mistakes in 12 hours were too much for a methodical, accurate-minded man, so he turned back to make sure. The next number to 14 was number 12, his own room. There was no number 13 after all. After some minutes devoted to a careful consideration of everything he had had to eat and drink during the last 24 hours, Anderson decided to give the question up. If his sight or his brain were giving way, he would have plenty of opportunities for ascertaining that fact. If not, then he was evidently being treated to a very interesting experience. In either case, the development of events would certainly be worth watching. During the day, he continued his examination of the episcopal correspondence, which I have already summarized. To his disappointment, it was incomplete. Only one other letter could be found, which referred to the affair of Magistrate Nicholas Franken. It was from Bishop Jorgen Fries to Rasmus Nielsen. He said, "Although we are not in the least degree inclined to assent to your judgment concerning our court, and shall be prepared, if need be, to withstand you to the uttermost in that behalf, yet, forasmuch as our trusty and well-beloved Magistrate Nicholas Franken, against whom you have dared to allege certain false and malicious charges, hath been suddenly removed from among us, it is apparent that the question for this time falls. But forasmuch as you further allege that the Apostle and Evangelist St. John in his heavenly apocalypse describes the Holy Roman Church under the guise and symbol of the Scarlet Woman, be it known to you, etc., etc." Search as he might, Anderson could find no sequel to this letter, nor any clue to the cause or matter of the removal of the casus belli. He could only suppose that Franken had died suddenly, and as there were only 2 days between the date of Nielsen's last letter, which Franken was evidently still in being, and that of the bishop's letter, the death must have been completely unexpected. In the afternoon he paid a short visit to Huld, and took his tea at Bakerlund. Nor could he notice, though he was in a somewhat nervous frame of mind, that there was any indication of such a failure of eye or brain as his experiences of this morning had led him to fear. At supper, he found himself next to the landlord. What, he asked him, after some indifferent conversation, is the reason why most of the hotels one visits in the country, the number 13 is left off the list of rooms? I see you have none here. The landlord seemed amused. To think that you should have noticed such a thing like that. I've thought about it once or twice myself, to tell the truth. An educated man, I've said, has no business with these superstitious notions. I was brought up myself here in the high school of Viborg, and our master was always a man to set his face against anything of that kind. He's been dead now these many years, a fine, upstanding man he was, and ready with his hands as well as his head. I recollect us boys, one snowy day. Here he plunged into reminiscence. Then you don't think there is any particular objection to having a number 13? Said Anderson. To be sure. Well, you understand, I was brought up to the business by my poor old father. He kept a hotel in Aarhus first, and then, when we were born, he moved to Viborg here, which was his native place, and had the Phoenix here until he died. That was 1876. Then I started business in Silkeborg, and only the year before last I moved into this house. Then followed more details as to the state of the house and the business when first taken over. And when you came here, there was a number... And when you came here, was there a number 13? No, I was going to tell you about that. You see, in a place like this, the commercial class, the travellers, are what we have to provide for in general. And put them in number 13, why, they'd as soon sleep in the street, or sooner. As far as I'm concerned myself, it wouldn't make a penny difference to me what the number of my room was, and so I've often said to them, but they stick to it that it brings bad luck. Quantities of stories they have among them of men who have slept in a number 13 and never been the same again, or lost their best customers, or one thing and another, said the landlord after searching for a more graphic phrase. Then what do you use your number 13 for? Said Anderson, conscious as he said the words of a curious anxiety quite disproportionate to the importance of the question. My number 13? Why don't I tell you that there isn't such a thing in the house? I thought you might have noticed that. If there was, it would be next door to your own room. Well, yes, only I happen to think there is. I fancied last night that I had seen a door numbered 13 in that passage, and really I am almost certain I must have been right, for I saw it the night before as well. Of course, Herr Christensen laughed at this notion to scorn, as Anderson had expected, and emphasized with iteration the fact that no number 13 existed or had existed before him in that hotel. Anderson was in some ways relieved by his certainty, but still puzzled, and he began to think that the best way to make sure whether he had indeed been subject to an illusion or not was to invite the landlord to his room to smoke a cigar later in the evening. Some photographs of English towns which he had with him formed a very sufficiently good excuse. Herr Christensen was flattered by the invitation, and most willingly accepted it. At about 10 o'clock he was to make his appearance, but before that Anderson had some letters to write, and retired for the purpose of writing them. He almost blushed to himself at confessing it, but he could not deny that it was the fact that he was becoming quite nervous about the question of the existence of number 13, so much so that he approached his room by way of number 11, in order that he might not be obliged to pass the door, or the place where the door ought to be. He looked quickly and suspiciously about the room when he entered it, but there was nothing beyond that indefinable air of being smaller than usual to warrant any misgivings. There was no question of the presence or absence of his portmanteau tonight. He had himself emptied it of its contents and lodged it under his bed. With a certain effort he dismissed the thoughts of number 13 from his mind, and sat down to his writing. His neighbours were quiet enough. Occasionally a door opened in the passage, and a pair of boots was thrown out, or a bagman walked past humming to himself, and outside, from time to time, a cart thudded over the atrocious cobblestones, or a quick step hurried along the flags. Anderson finished his letters, ordered in whisky and soda, and then went to the window and studied the dead wall opposite and the shadows upon it. As far as he could remember, number 14 had been occupied by the lawyer, a staid man who said little at meals, being generally engaged in studying a small bundle of papers beside his plate. Apparently, however, he was in the habit of giving vent to his animal spirits while alone. Why else should he be dancing? The shadow from the next room evidently showed that he was. Again and again his thin form crossed the window, his arms waved, and a gaunt leg was kicked up with surprising agility. He seemed to be barefooted, and the floor must be well laid, for no sound betrayed his movements. Sagfore Herr Anders Jensen, dancing at 10 o'clock at night in a hotel bedroom, seemed a fitting subject for a historical painting in the grand style, and Andersen's thoughts, like those of Emily in The Mysteries of Udolpho, began to arrange themselves into the following lines. When I return to my hotel at 10 o'clock p.m., the waiters think I am unwell. I do not care for them. But when I've locked my chamber door and put my boots outside, I dance all night upon the floor, and even if my neighbours swore, I'd go on dancing all the more. For I am acquainted with the law, and in despite of all their jaw, their protests I deride. Had not the landlord at this moment knocked on the door, it is probable that quite a long poem might have been laid before the reader. To judge from his look of surprise when he found himself in the room, Herr Christensen was struck, as Andersen had been, by something unusual in its aspect. But he made no remark. Andersen's photographs interested him mightily and formed the text of many autobiographical discourses. Nor is it quite clear how the conversation could have been diverted into the desired channel of number 13, had not the lawyer at this moment began to sing, and to sing in a manner which could leave no doubt in anyone's mind that he was either exceedingly drunk or raving mad. It was a high, thin voice that they heard, and it seemed dry, as if from long disuse. Of words or tune there was no question. It went sailing up to a surprising height, and was carried down by a despairing moan as of a winter wind in a hollow chimney, or an organ whose wind suddenly fails. It was a really horrible sound, and Andersen felt that if he had been alone he might have fled for refuge in society to some neighbour bagman's room. The landlord sat open-mouthed. "I don't understand it," he said at last, wiping his forehead. "It is dreadful. I have heard it once before, but I made sure it was a cat." "Is he mad?" said Andersen. "He must be. And what a sad thing. Such a good customer, too, and so successful in his business. By what I hear, a young family to bring up." Just then came an impatient knock on the door, and the knocker entered, without waiting to be asked. It was the lawyer, in dishabille, and very rough-haired, and very angry he looked. "I beg pardon, sir," he said, "but I should be much obliged if you would kindly desist—" Here he stopped, for it was evident that neither of the persons before him was responsible for the disturbance, and after a moment's lull it swelled forth again more wildly than before. "But what in the name of heaven does it mean?" broke out the lawyer. "Where is it? Who is it? Am I going out of my mind?" "Surely, Herr Jensen, it comes from your room next door. Isn't there a cat or something stuck in the chimney?" This was the best that occurred to Andersen to say, and he realized its futility as he spoke. But anything was better than to stand and listen to that horrible voice, and look at the broad, white face of the landlord, all perspiring and quivering as he clutched the arms of his chair. "Impossible," said the lawyer. "Impossible. There is no chimney. I came here because I was convinced the noise was going on here. It was certainly in the next room to mine." "Was there no door between yours and mine?" said Andersen eagerly. "No, sir," said Herr Jensen rather sharply. "At least, not this morning." "Ah," said Andersen. "Nor tonight?" "I am not sure," said the lawyer with some hesitation. Suddenly the crying or singing voice in the next room died away, and the singer was heard seemingly to laugh to himself in a crooning manner. The three men actually shivered at the sound. Then there was a silence. "Come," said the lawyer. "What have you to say, Herr Christensen? What does this mean?" "Good heavens," said Christensen, "how should I tell? I know no more than you, gentlemen. I pray I may never hear such a noise again." "So do I," said Herr Jensen, and he added something under his breath. Anderson thought it sounded like the last words of the Psalter, "Omnis spiritus laudet Dominum," but he could not be sure. "But we must do something," said Anderson. "The three of us. Shall we go and investigate the next room?" "But that is Herr Jansen's room," wailed the landlord. "It is no use. He has come from there himself." I am not so sure," said Jensen. "I think this gentleman is right. We must go and see." The only weapons of defence that could be mustered on the spot were a stick and an umbrella. The expedition went out into the passage, not without quakings. There was a deadly quiet outside, but a light shone from under the next door. Anderson and Jensen approached it. The latter turned the handle and gave a sudden, vigorous push. No use. The door stood fast. "Herr Christensen," said Jensen, "will you go and fetch the strongest servant you have in the place? We must see this through." The landlord nodded and hurried off, glad to be away from the scene of action. Jensen and Anderson remained outside, looking at the door. "It is number 13, you see," said the latter. "Yes. There is your door, and there is mine," said Jensen. "My room has only 3 windows in the daytime," said Anderson. "My room has 3 windows in the daytime," said Anderson, with a difficulty suppressing a nervous laugh. "By George, so has mine," said the lawyer, turning and looking at Anderson. His back was now to the door. At that moment, the door opened, and an arm came out and clawed at his shoulder. It was clad in ragged, yellowish linen, and the bare skin, where it could be seen, had long grey hairs upon it. Anderson was just in time to pull Jensen out of its reach with a cry of disgust and fright when the door shut again, and a low laugh was heard. Jensen had seen nothing, but when Anderson hurriedly told him what a risk he had run, he fell into a great state of agitation and suggested that they should retire from the enterprise and lock themselves up in one of their or other of their rooms. However, while he was developing this plan, the landlord and 2 able-bodied men arrived on the scene, all looking rather serious and alarmed. Jensen met them with a torrent of description and explanation, which did not at all tend to encourage them into the fray. The men dropped the crowbars they had brought and said flatly that they were not going to risk their throats in that devil's den. The landlord was miserably nervous and undecided, conscious that if the danger were not faced, his hotel was ruined, and very loath to face it himself. Luckily, Anderson hit upon a way of rallying the demoralized force. "Is this," he said, "the Danish courage I have heard so much of? It isn't a German in there, and if it was, we are 5-1. The 2 servants and Jensen were stung into action by this, and made a dash at the door. "Stop," said Anderson. "Don't lose your heads. You stay out here with the light, landlord, and one of you 2 men break in the door, and don't go in when it gives way." The men nodded, and the younger stepped forward, raised his crowbar, and dealt a tremendous blow to the upper panel. The results were not in the least what any of them had anticipated. There was no cracking or rending of wood, only a dull sound as if a solid wall had been struck. The man dropped his tool with a shout and began rubbing his elbow. His cry drew their eyes upon him for a moment. Then Anderson looked at the door again. It was gone. The plaster wall of the passage stared him in the face, with a considerable gash in it where the crowbar had struck. Number 13 had passed out of existence. For a brief space, they stood perfectly still, gazing at the blank wall. An early cock in the yard beneath was heard to crow, and as Anderson glanced in the direction of the sound, he saw that the window at the end of the long passage, that the eastern sky was paling to the dawn. "Perhaps," said the landlord with hesitation, "you gentlemen would like another room for tonight? A double-bedded one?" Neither Jensen nor Anderson were averse to the suggestion. They felt inclined to hunt in couples after their late experience. It was found convenient, when each of them went to his room to collect the articles he wanted for the night, that the other should go with him and hold the candle. They noticed that both number 12 and number 14 had 3 windows. Next morning the same party reassembled in number 12. The landlord was naturally anxious to avoid engaging outside help, and yet it was imperative that the mystery attached to that part of the house should be cleared up. Accordingly, the two servants had been induced to take upon them the function of carpenters. The furniture was cleared away, and, at the cost of a good many irretrievably damaged planks, that portion of the floor was taken up which lay nearest to number 14. You will naturally suppose that a skeleton, say that of Magistrate Nicholas Franken, was discovered. That was not so. What they did find, lying between the beams which supported the flooring, was a small copper box. In it was a neatly folded vellum document with about 20 lines of writing. Both Anderson and Jensen, who proved to be something of a paleographer, were much excited by this discovery, which promised to afford the key to these extraordinary phenomena. I possess a copy of an astrological work, which I have never read. It has, by way of frontispiece, a woodcut by Hans Siebel Behm, representing a number of sages seated round a table. This detail may enable connoisseurs to identify the book. I cannot myself recollect its title, and it is not at this moment within reach, but the fly-leaves of it are covered with writing, and during the 10 years in which I have owned the volume, I have not been able to determine which way up this writing ought to be read, much less what language it is in. Not dissimilar was the position of Anderson and Jensen after the protracted examination to which they subjected the document in the copper box. After 2 days' contemplation of it, Jensen, who was the bolder spirit of the two, hazarded the conjecture that the language was either Latin or Old Danish. Anderson ventured upon no surmises, and was very willing to surrender the box and the parchment to the Historical Society of Viborg to be placed in their museum. I had the whole story from him a few months later, as we sat in a wood near Uppsala, after a visit to the library there, which we, or rather I, had laughed, over the contract by which Daniel Salthenius, in later life professor of Hebrew at Königsberg, sold himself to Satan. Anderson was not really amused. "Young idiot," he said, meaning Salthenius, who was only an undergraduate when he committed that indiscretion. How did he know what company he was courting? And when I suggested the usual considerations, he only grunted. That same afternoon he told me what you have read, but he refused to draw any inferences from it, and to assent to any that I drew for him. And that is number 13. A lovely little tale where we learn that the way to get a Danish person to do what you want is to make fun of them for being afraid of Germans. I think that's the moral. So thank you all very much for joining me. I've got a few Ko-fis to read at the end here. So Ko-fi from EdgeDancer77. A very Merry Christmas to you both. Thank you so much for the many hours of entertainment you've provided over the past year, and I wish you all the best in 2023. Wish you all the best next year as well. Another Ko-fi from Maddie. A real Ko-fi message this time. Thank you and Sasha both for being amazing bosses as always. To Jester being my Friday buddy mod most weeks, and to Chat, who somehow are the best community I've ever seen on Twitch. Happy whatever, and here's to the new year of streams. Also love to the cats. Maddie, thank you, but also you know you don't have to donate to Ko-fi. You can just put it in the Discord. I appreciate it, but it's a circular that you're paying your. It's fine. Ko-fi from Lotus Flower. Happy whatever, everyone. Be safe, stay warm, and may much merriment be had. Always happy and proud to be part of this community. Ko-fi from Evil Auntie. Merry Crimbles to one and all, and thank you, Johnny, for providing this holiday tradition that has already become my personal favourite. Aww. Ko-fi from Grim Animator. Thanks for the stories. You're very welcome. Ko-fi from Podzol? Poxol. Hello. I've been saving last year's stories for Christmas and wasn't aware this was a yearly occurrence. A lovely surprise. I'm envious of everyone's cold weather as it's 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 21 degrees Celsius here. Luckily my aircon's broke, so it feels much colder. Hope you all have happy holidays. Happy holidays to you too. Sorry. Well, actually, you know what? it depends on how long I've been out in the cold, how much I value the cold. When I'm just stepping out, I'm like, oh, it's so bracing and cold. When I've been out there for a few hours, I'm like, I would not say no to 21 degrees. Kofi from Margaret. Happy holidays from Prague. Thanks for the spooks. Oh, thank you. And I'm glad you enjoyed the spooks. Great Value Serotonin's gifted a tier 1 sub and also subscribed at tier 1. Thank you. And a 4-part Kofi from Tzigi. Hello, Johnny et al. Long time no see, brackets live, so I am all the happier to be able to catch the stream. I have spent the last few months doing 2 awesome but terribly time-consuming things, starting a 5-year research project at work, history of multilingualism in minoritised communities, and finishing 5 years of house renovations. We bought a ruin of what's called a Polish cube, a house from the communist times, the biggest a house could be before one got mandatory government-issued tenants, and spent the last 5 years basically rebuilding the insides to modern standards. We're finally moving in at the beginning of February. I think I will be able to finally catch up on all the VODs while carrying furniture. Luckily, I've been downloading them as regularly as fieldwork allows, so I have a pretty complete archive. Sorry for rambling, but I'm delighted to be back here, at least for this one evening. Merry Christmas, or acceptable equivalent from the Pantheon, / lack thereof, of your choice. That's a really lovely message. I'm very happy that you're able to catch it live as well, Ziggy, and hopefully more in future. I hope the VODs stand you in very good stead when you're doing all your house move. And a Kofi from Emery. Hi Johnny, hope you and Sasha are having a lovely holiday. I'm currently alone in the UK since my family's back in my home country and my friends are with their families. This stream is giving me all the festive vibes I need, so thanks very much. You're very welcome. I'm sorry to hear that you're having a solo Christmas. I hope you managed to. Sometimes solo Christmas can be nice. I've only had 1 or 2 in my life, but and like one of them was a bit depressing. One of them was really lovely. So I hope that you're able to have a wonderful Christmas in your own company, and you know, treat yourself. And a Kofi from Great Value Serotonin. Hi, I'm happy to be here and glad you read my message. Hope you and everyone are doing well. We are, and I hope you're doing very well as well. So thank you all to thank you to everyone who joined. Thank you to everyone who donated to Kofi. Yes.
Could you do me a favour?
I could do you a favour.
Because you've got this is the story reading stream.
Oh yes.
I'm going to be changing my book club time for the new year, and I want to tell people about it in a way that isn't just at the book club that I'm at, because
of course.
Then people who can't make the book club time that it is now
sure
will hear about it.
Those of you who have joined just for the stream and aren't super familiar with how me and Sash do streams, I generally stream a video game on Friday evenings, and on Sunday in the afternoon Sash does what's known as Jane Austen Book Club, where he reads are you finished Emma now, or are you just finishing?
I'm finishing Emma next week, and in the new year, in January, we're starting Persuasion. So what we do is I read the book out loud, and you can read along, and then I also explain the book.
Yes.
Like, as somebody who knows a lot about Jane Austen, knows the text very well, and is doing an MA in social and economic history of that time period, I will stop and be like, just so you know, a barouche is a sports car, so this is denoting that this guy's having a midlife crisis.
Exactly. So if you want to know about which Jane Austen characters are having midlife crises, brackets all the dads, you want to join Jane Austen Book Club. Now,
at the moment it's on Sundays.
At the moment it's normally on Sundays at 3 p.m, but
from next year it will be on Mondays at 6:30 p.m. BST.
So BST or GMT? We're currently in GMT.
Oh, GMT, British time. It'll be 6:30 British time PM.
So yes, from the new year, it will be Mondays 6:30 British time in the evening. Will be Jane Austen Book Club. It's an hour, and if you enjoy stories, and you want to learn a bit more about, if you enjoy Jane Austen, which, let's be real, you do. Even if you think you don't, like, Jane Austen's just a good time. Then do join, especially because Sasha's starting a new book in the new year, Persuasion. So you don't need to worry about like, but I'm not gonna know what's happened in Pride and Prejudice? Is
very
Mr. Darcy
insulting-
is
that's a
Mr.
very
Darcy the bad
insulting-
guy?
It's a very insulting impression of chap that you've done. Like, uncanny, but insulting.
Yeah, well, you know. Yes. If you're interested, and you should be, give Book Club a look. Oh, and on Sunday evenings at 8, we stream. We do game streams, generally board games or little role-playing games. But sometimes we just paint miniatures or hang. So thank you all very much for joining me. If you enjoyed these readings, also check out my Bandcamp, where I've currently got one collection of 5 short ghost stories, story readings up, and we'll hopefully have more soon. Thank you again for all the subscriptions, the Ko-fis that are divided by between us and the mods. And a last Ko-fi from Maya. Happy Hanukkah. It's the 5th day today. Yippee. Happy Hanukkah to you as well. And yes. So, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Holidays, and joyful festivals to all those who have festivals. And to those of you who don't, I hope that you find warmth, comfort, and happiness in this winter. Except those of you who aren't in winter at the moment, you're in summer, where I hope you just have a good time. Hope you're having a nice one. Anyway, thank you all. And, there won't be any streams on Sunday, this Sunday, for obvious reasons.
It's Christmas Day!
It's Christmas Day. And we're going to be Sasha's dad. So, thank you all, and have a good night. Goodbye.